Next up is our dearest, very own Maulana Maududi. He is one of the most prolific writers of the 20th century. And I say prolific writers, I don't just mean prolific Islamist writers. The man would just write and write and write. He really was prolific in terms of his written output. He was born in 1903 in Hyderabad, Deccan, which, as you know, or should know at least, was a Muslim state ruled by a kind of, it's what we call a princely state. It was ruled by a Jagirdar and so on and so forth. He began his career actually as a journalist. So he had not actually studied in a madrasa and gotten the sanad of the madrasa. He had what we would call a modernist education as such. And soon after, he actually became a journalist. In fact, all his life he was hounded by the more traditionalist ulama who said, well, you've actually never studied in a madrasa, etc. But of course, he came from a religious family, so he got religious instruction from his family as well. In 1938, after meeting the famous Muslim poet Muhammad Iqbal, Maududi moved to a piece of land in the village of Pathankot in the Punjab to oversee a waqf, which was the Islamic foundation called Darul Islam. That was a very key move, which allowed him, of course, in 1941, then, just 3 years later, to create the Jamaat-e-Islami. It was from the Waqf that he was able to get that base and so on, and create the Jamaat-e-Islami. The Jamaat-e-Islami was actually opposed to the partition of India. They thought this will divide the Ummah. In fact, if you read Maududi's writings in the 30s and the 1940s, and I'll send you a video, etc., if you want to review them, he thought Muslim nationalism was contrary to the concept of the Ummah, because here you are, you're going to take out a little bit of, you're going to take out a couple of million Muslims and create a separate state, but that's not what is the message of Islam. Later, much later, he reconciled to this idea. He was also very, very critical of Muhammad Ali Jinnah, about whom he said that this guy doesn't know anything about Islam, and therefore he should not be the leader of Muslims. And also the second and very important aspect of Maududi's writing is the view that which he carried throughout his life, which was the view that in fact South Asian Muslims, us people as Muslims, we are fake Muslims. We're not real Muslims because we come from a Hindu heritage and we have continued many of those traditions. And one of his big missions in life was also to purify Islam within South Asia, purify it from Hindu influences. So in that sense you're right, but in the political sense, as supporter of Muslim nationalism, absolutely not. Not in this period at all. In the 1950s, then he came over to Pakistan after the riots and so on, and his early writings, of course, were very, very critical of democracy. He denounced it as a Western concept. In fact, there was even a time when he said things like it's an un-Islamic thing to go and vote. But in the 1950s, his opinion began to change. When he came to Pakistan, he realized that the Jamaat-e-Islami has to be involved at some level in the political process in Pakistan. It has to be involved in politics. So this opinion began to change, and as it began to change, it also resulted in a series of splits within the Jamaat-e-Islami, because certain hardliners said, no, this was not the original agenda of the Jamaat-e-Islami and you're changing it. One split occurred in 51, another split occurred in 56, 57. In fact, if you look at Tanzim-e-Islami, which is the party of Dr. Israr Ahmad, it came out of the Jamaat-e-Islami exactly on this particular issue, that Dr. Israr thought that the Islamic Party should not be participating in election at any level, etc. In 53, he was very much involved in the anti-Ahmadi agitation. You could say he led that campaign. In fact, he wrote a lot about it, spoke a lot about it. By the way, this is a wonderful website created by LUMS itself, by Dr. Ali Usman Kasmi, about the 53 riots. Do have a look at it. These riots led to the death of about 200 people. And selective martial law in several cities were created. Lahore mein bade riots hue the, in fact. And Maududi was arrested for provoking these riots and creating them. And in fact, there was a trial against him and he was sentenced to death. They said that he is responsible for the murder of these 200 people. He's going to be sentenced to death. But he spent 2 years in jail, after which he was forgiven and he was released from prison. In fact, because of his intransigent stance against the Ahmadis and because he refused to repent and so on, did his jail sentence and came back out, now Maududi became a major figure in Pakistani politics. The 1956 constitution, which is here, you can see being signed into law by Prime Minister Chaudhry Muhammad Ali, was to a very large extent a compromise with the Jamaat-e-Islami. Like the state said, all right, what do you want? We'll add that and you support it, etc. And they did support it. Islam was declared for the first time as a state religion in the 1956 constitution, not earlier than that. The Dominion of Pakistan now suddenly became, this was the original name of Pakistan if you didn't know, now it became the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, and Maududi claimed that the 56 constitution was a victory for Islam. So you can see he's getting involved in the political process here. Then came Ayub Khan in 58, and Ayub took a more secularist stance than before, and he went on the offensive against the ulama, etc. In particular, he changed this particular law. He introduced the Muslim Family Laws Ordinance, MFLO, in 1961. This is a very important piece of legislation that the feminists have supported and fought for since 60s. And it's something that, at least at that time, the ulama fought against. What was in this thing? Well, the MFLO stipulated it required men to seek permission from an arbitration council comprising family members and officials before contracting a second marriage. It also required that the first wife be informed, and the council had to assess whether the second marriage was in fact justified. So it wasn't up to you alone whether you could marry a second time. You had to get all these permissions from your first biwi, who of course is never going to give you permission, etc. And you had to get permission from the family and God knows who else, etc. And the ulama just thought this violated Islamic law. They said that men have unrestricted right to have as many as 4 wives. They don't have to ask anybody for that. That is not what Sharia says. Moreover, the law said the husbands must provide written notice of divorce to the chairman of the union council, the local government union council, to aap jante hain. And the divorce would not take effect until 90 days after the notice was issued, allowing for reconciliation efforts. Ulama argued this is absolutely wrong. If I say talaq, talaq, talaq 3 times, it's done, it's over, it's immediate, it's instantaneous. I don't need to give this in writing anywhere. I've said it 3 times, it's over. So that was the older, I guess, point of view. And the new point of view was no. You have to give it in writing, etc. And you have 90 days to think about it. Why? Because divorce is made more difficult here for the man, because, well, it gives a lot more power to the man कि भाई मेरी बात नहीं मानी चलो तुम फिर सड़क पे जाओ, and it wasn't really very fair. The other stipulation was that orphan grandchildren were allowed to inherit from their deceased grandparents' estates. So what happens if grandparents are alive, they have children, and the children have children, but somehow the parents die before the grandparents die? What happens? So the ulama always said that the property will go to the next of kin of the grandparents. That means the grandfather's brother will get the property rather than it coming to the grandchildren. So this was also changed. And Ayub Khan said, no, it has to go to the grandchildren. This is not right that it should go to the brother. And the ulama, of course, said, no, this is not the Islamic way. The Islamic way is that it goes to the brother. The ordinance also allowed women to include specific conditions in their nikah nama. So if you ever look at a nikah nama today, it's a written contract. Of course, you haven't looked at a nikah nama, have you? None of you have. I have. So it's a written contract. It didn't have to be written in the past. It could be written in the past, but it didn't have to be written. So you could just have an agreement and that sort of thing. But now the nikah nama was something that had to be written, and then it had to be notarized, and then it had to be submitted to the union council that would keep a copy of the nikah nama. Everything has to be done in writing now. And in that nikah nama, you could actually write. Now, the women they could actually always do it, frankly, but now it could be in writing, okay, I will marry this guy, but only on the condition that he will never take a second wife. He will never take a second wife. Or you could put other things, like for example, you could say, okay, I forbid my husband to go to LUMS, or I don't teach at LUMS, or you could write anything you wanted to as long as it was mutually agreed. Whatever it was that you stipulated, like for example, if you say, okay, even, as you know, you could even say that if my husband does not satisfy me intimately, then it's over, etc. You could even write those kinds of intimate things, etc. By the way, there are also examples of marriage contracts in Islamic history where women say, I will marry this guy, but I don't want to go to bed with this guy. Yes, I will not have any intimacy with this person, etc. It's just a marriage for the property and state and that sort of thing, etc. You could even write those sorts of things in a nikah nama. But now all of that is in, before that was of course between the two partners and the families. Now it was in writing, it could be in writing. The main thing of course was not these sorts of things that I have emphasized, that was just an aside that I thought is very interesting. If you're ever interested in reading more about that, Keisha Ali has a great book on Islamic marriage and how it was shaped and what its thinking was, how it was always considered to be a contract, a contractual thing, which is very interesting because Christian marriage is a contract between you and God. But Islamic marriage is a contract between two people and has to be mutual for that particular reason. So that's also very interesting, but we'll talk about that some other time. But the ulama didn't like this because now it was in writing, it was formalized, it was notarized and so on. And they thought that all the women are going to basically say not only that they have the right of divorce, but that their man should not marry a second time. By the way, there is still a checkbox in your nikah nama. Whenever you get married, please note, boys and girls, okay, there is still a checkbox in your nikah nama which you have to actually cross to make sure that you have the right to divorce. If you do not cross it, by default, you do not have the right to divorce, etc. You have the right to be divorced by the husband, but you do not have the right to divorce your husband. So make sure you check that box, okay? MFLO made it mandatory to register all marriages and divorces with the local authorities. This also they thought is anti-Sharia. Mawdudi was totally against this, and all the traditional ulama were also against this. He said this is completely a violation of what Sharia says, etc. And they campaigned against the MFLO, and but to no avail. It not only did not get reversed, but in fact, it is now the law of Pakistan, and the ulama have also accepted it as the law of Pakistan. In fact, they are the ones today who come and fill out the boxes for you and even get it notarized for you today. Against Ayub Khan rises Fatima Jinnah, and Fatima Jinnah is largely supported by the secular opposition of Pakistan, that is by people like, you can see who's sitting over here right next to Fatima Jinnah. Yeah, that's Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, exactly. Sorwardi, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, National Awami Party, वगैरह. All these folks are basically with Fatima Jinnah. Where is Mr. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, by the way? He is with Ayub Khan, okay? He is not with this opposition, etc. Here is Fatima Jinnah addressing people in Dhaka. Look at that rally, massive. So previously, Mawdudi and pretty much all the scholars had said that women cannot be, kind of be the head of state and rule over Muslim countries. But Mawdudi said, no, we will support Fatima Jinnah. And this was a very unconventional thing for Mawdudi himself to do. And he got some backlash from the conservatives, etc. for it as well. But he said, no, this is important. So here's another example of how Jamaat-e-Islami becomes more and more involved in the political process, even in the mainstream, right? Now, Jamaat-e-Islami, after Ayub Khan is overthrown, etc., resigns because of a big mass movement. Yahya comes to power. Jamaat-e-Islami loves Yahya Khan. You might be sure. They hated Ayub, but they loved Yahya Khan, etc. Mia Tufail even said, Yahya is the champion of Islam. Why did they like Yahya Khan? Because Yahya Khan was very anti the left. He was very anti-main Awami League, etc., leftism as a whole, etc. And Yahya also started this discourse of Islam is in danger. Who's putting it in danger? The secular parties, especially the Bengali nationalists and other nationalists in Pakistan, etc. So military establishment and Jamaat-e-Islami began to work very closely against the Awami League. In East Pakistan, if you read General Rao's book, etc., they started working very closely together against the Awami League. Awami League was hugely popular, of course, in what is now Bangladesh. In 1970, Yahya holds the election. The Jamaat-e-Islami campaigns against the People's Party and Awami League, etc. By this time, socialism is the rage in the Muslim world. In the 1968 movement, anti-EU movement, socialism suddenly becomes like a mainstream idea. Everybody's talking about it. The big parties of Pakistan are all socialist. The big parties in the most of the third world are all basically pro-socialist. The big socialist party in West Pakistan, there were many others, etc., but the biggest one, of course, that claimed to be socialist was the Pakistan People's Party. So Jamaat-e-Islami mainly ran against the PPP's socialist slogans of Roti, Kapda, Makan, etc. They fielded 151 candidates all across the country. Unfortunately, they only got 4 seats in the National Assembly and 4 seats in the Provincial Assembly. It was a crushing defeat for them. They did not expect that they would lose this badly because they thought, well, public supports us. And it seemed like they had that mobilized strength. But when it actually came to the vote, people didn't vote for them. People voted for Bhutto instead. And so Awami League swept the East Pakistan. They won everything except 2 seats. 162, misses 160 seats they won. I don't think any political party in any country has swept, an area like the Awami League swept East Pakistan. And People's Party swept mainly Punjab and Sindh. It did not win in KP and it did not win in Balochistan, but Punjab and Sindh, it had overwhelming support. Now, Jamaat-e-Islami supported the military operation of 71 in Bangladesh. Of course, Yahya was not going to hand over power to Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and the Awami League, etc. So Razakars were created. These were the people who were saying we want to stay with Pakistan and we want to fight against a secular Awami League, etc. And Jamaat-e-Islami created its own brigades. One was Al-Shams, the other was Al-Badr Brigade, which were later accused of war crimes and rapes, etc. And their leaders were in fact given the death sentence in Sheikh Hasina's tenure. Now, opposition to socialism became the main plank of the Jamaat-e-Islami in the 1970s. And in fact, this is when Jamaat-e-Islami also has its heyday. Its biggest kind of, it's not the biggest party in terms of vote getting, but it becomes very, very big in terms of cadres at colleges and universities. Jamiat becomes very strong, etc. Because it's the main party that is arguing the case against socialism. The others may be somewhat wishy-washy about it, or even if they're not wishy-washy about it, they don't have these kind of cogent arguments that the Jamaat is able to develop. Maududi himself, though, withdraws from politics because of ill health, etc. He resigns as Amir of Jamaat-e-Islami in 1972. But in the 70s now, this new movement becomes very popular called Nizam-e-Mustafa, which is basically against the People's Party, Bhutto's government. And this Nizam-e-Mustafa comes together in the Pakistan National Alliance, which is an alliance of 9 political parties against the Pakistan People's Party. So just as today you have all these parties against PTI today, in the past you had all the parties on one side and the People's Party on the other side. People used to say there are only 2 parties, People's Party and Anti-People's Party, right? So it certainly seemed like that at that time. Bhutto in fact went to Maududi, who was not that well, etc., and said, help me resolve the conflict between PNA and PPP, etc., after the 77 election, when the PNA was saying कि बहुत ज़्यादा rigging हुई है and we don't accept the election results and so on. But Maududi did not obviously go with Bhutto. Instead, he went with Zia and he supported Ziaul Haq's decision that yes, Bhutto should be given should be executed. Of course, he passed away in 77 and Bhutto was executed much later. But nonetheless, he set the ball rolling in that particular direction. Here is the funeral of Maulana Maududi in 77, as you can see, pretty massive and large. Now Ziaul Haq comes to power, and at the same time you have the Afghan revolution and you have the Iranian revolution, both of which propel the Jamaat-e-Islami forward in terms of the state more and more accepting them, etc. Zia's Islamization is basically designed by the Jamaat-e-Islami. When I was reading Hassan al-Banna, you notice that it's very close to Zia's Islamization as well. It's pretty much the same, right? And Western and Saudi support started coming in a big way, not only to Ziaul Haq, but also to the Mujahideen, to all the religious parties, etc. Go and fight the evil communists in Afghanistan, etc. Ironically, here's the big irony in the history of the Jamaat-e-Islami. Although they gained a lot in terms of their support within the state, actually the 80s is also the period where they lost support in terms of the public. So state influence increased, public influence actually declined in the 1980s, strangely, mainly because Ziaul Haq was deeply, deeply unpopular in Pakistan, and Jamaat-e-Islami, while Maududi had passed away, Jamaat-e-Islami now had other leaders, etc., Mia Tufail, and then later Qazi, Hussain, and so on. But its popularity never went back up to its pinnacle, which was in the 1970s. Now, to Maududi's writing, what did he say? He said, Westernism is political slavery has given birth to an inferiority complex amongst all you people. You have come to accept Westernism, etc., and that is the main problem. This is intellectual serfdom. It has swept over the Muslim world and put people off balance. Anyway, the main problem with the Muslim world is they have adopted nationalism, they have adopted secularism, they have forgotten about Islam. Pakistan needs to be redefined. Remember I said Jamaat-e-Islami did not support the creation of Pakistan, certainly did not support this westernized liberal thinker. By the way, Jinnah was a liberal and very explicitly so says this in his writing. Very much inspired by English liberalism, not to mention also Indian liberalism. We can do a lecture on that some other time. But anyway, he said Pakistan has to become the homeland of Islam. If Pakistan, having instead of an Islamic constitution, has a secular, yani a godless constitution, What was the purpose of creating Pakistan? He says, if you're going to have British civil and criminal procedural codes, etc., etc., the whole purpose of Pakistan, he says, is to have Sharia. If we simply intended to implement any socialistic program, we could have done so in collaboration with the communist and socialist parties of India without plunging the nation into this great bloodbath and mighty ordeal. Of course, the Communist party of India was a very strong party and still is a very strong party, etc. So he says God is the only source of law in a Muslim society. So first, the powers and the organs through which our free will functions are gifts from God, not a result of our own effort. Please note, this point of view on free will is very close to the Ash'ari point of view, etc. Secondly, the independence of choice itself has been delegated to us by God and not won by us through our personal endeavor. This is again anti-Mutazila point of view. All those things in which our free will operates are not only the property but also the creation of God. Again, this is the point of view of the Jabarite thought, etc. The territory in which we exercise our independence and freedom is also the territory of God. The harmonization of human life with the universe dictates the necessity of there being one sovereign and a common source of law for both spheres of human activity, the voluntary and the involuntary, or in other words, the moral and the physical. In other words, God is sovereign in a very real sense, not just in the sense that he created the universe, but even in the political sense that we have to follow his law. वो अलग मामला है कि there are actually very different interpretations of the law because of legal pluralism in Islam. Now there are two issues here. There are of course those things that are maroof and those things that are munkir, those things that are prohibited, vices and virtues. Maroof things also have three categories: what is faz and what is wajib, etc., what is mandatory, what is matloob, etc., and what is mubah, yani ke it is permissible but not necessarily farz, etc. Everything that is not expressly prohibited is not necessarily a bad thing, and amongst the things that are munkir for us, there are haram things and makruh things. Makruh just means disliked, but makruh cheez hai. So he lays down in this way what Sharia is. Sharia is a complete scheme of life. He says it's an organic whole, and there are some secular people like LUMS professors who only take one law and they only talk about that one law, etc. And that's not right. You have to think about it as a holistic system, etc. For example, amputation of the hand is only promulgated in a full-fledged Islamic society, not in a society where the rich exploit the poor, etc. So somehow or the other, we're going to have this classless utopia. Then you can have this punishment of cutting off hands. Similarly, he says the same thing about stoning to death as well as the punishment for adultery, etc., which is 100 lashes and stoning to death if you're married, etc. He says when you eliminate all the bad things in society, all the nudity in society, all the temptations in society, only then can you have this particular punishment, not before that, etc. So in that way, he says the had punishments, etc., ought to be supported, but they will only be supported once everything is implemented. Nonetheless, as you know, Jamaat-e-Islami has always argued for the case of the implementation of these kinds of laws in the legal code of Pakistan from today, not from tomorrow. So there's a kind of call of fail mitazad here. Then he takes law, he divides into three parts: administrative law, public and personal law, international law. It doesn't say anything very particularly interesting except for saying in this article that Islam has a complete code for all of these things, for administration, for public and personal law, as well as for international law. There are unalterable elements in Islamic law. This, I think, is the most interesting part of what he says. He says, like, for example, things that are mentioned directly in the Quran about alcohol, interest, gambling, punishments prescribed for adultery and theft, and the rules of inheritance. These cannot be changed. These are unalterable because they are mentioned directly in the Quran. And similarly, in the Quran and Hadith, we have a prohibition of intoxicants. We have the nullification of all exchange transactions that are not the outcome of the free will of both parties, etc. And we have the principle that men are the protectors and in charge of women, etc. These principles also, you cannot alter them. You can argue till the end of the day, but this is just something which is kind of like, you cannot even debate it. It's that's God's command directly. Limitation in connection with the plurality of wives, where the maximum number has been fixed at 4, or the limitation that the number of divorces to a wife cannot exceed 3, or the limitation imposed on will, the amount of which cannot exceed 1/3 of the total inheritance. These are the things directly mentioned in the Quran. You can't change them. Okay? What are the things then you can change? Well, first let's understand the way of changing them. You can do it by ta'wil, you can do it by qiyas, you can do it by ijtihad, and you can do it by istihsan, juristic preference, etc. But he says every Tom, Dick and Harry is not entitled to exercise the right of ta'wil, qiyas, ijtihad or istihsan. This is only going to be done by the scholars, by the ulama themselves. You can't go and do it unless you are one of the scholars. Now, these laws, he says, are not for this filthy society. Oh, there's a slide, it should have been before. He says, for example, adultery and fornication mein, Islam prescribes 100 stripes for the unmarried and stoning to death for the married partners in the crime, if you do adultery or fornication. But this applies to a society wherein every trace of suggestiveness has been destroyed, where mixed gatherings of men and women have been prohibited, where public appearances of painted and pampered women is completely non-existent, where marriage has been made easy, where virtue, piety and charity are current coins, etc. So somehow we're going to reform society's understanding of sexuality, and then we'll implement this law, and then there will be no adultery and fornication at all. These punishments are not meant for that filthy society, the one we live in today, wherein sexual excitement is rampant, wherein nude pictures, obscene books and vulgar songs have become common recreations, wherein sexual perversions have taken hold of the cinema and all other places of amusement, wherein mixed semi-nude parties are considered the acme of social progress, and wherein economic conditions and social customs have made marriage extremely difficult. He wanted marriage to be very easy. Now some people say Islamic laws are antiquated, but this is not true. This process of the evolution of Islamic law, he says, did not stop all the way to the 19th century. So all these years Islamic law has been developing, etc. And it's only for the last 100 years that it stopped developing, and this is a small problem, only a century long problem. We can fix it. Islamic law as such is not stagnant in his view. Some people say Islamic laws are relics of barbarism. He says this charge comes from the West. He does not punish by stoning to death, but he can kill people indiscriminately with the atom bomb. He's talking about Westerners. Okay, oh, they don't say, okay, we're going to punish you by stoning you to death, but they look at what they're doing in Gaza, right? He does not merely cut off the hands of the people, but he also tears their bodies into shreds. He is not content with flogging. He would like to burn alive the people en masse and manufacture a soap out of the fat extracted from their dead bodies. That's the West for you. No, it is important to recognize that the West does all of these things. Yes, I agree. But it doesn't do it with its own citizens. It does it as an imperial and colonizing power. As if you're a citizen of the West, then you are protected by the law, etc. But if you're not, you're a Palestinian, then yes, all of these horrible things do happen to you. The reason for this, their hysterical outbursts against this alleged barbarism lies actually in the perversion of their moral values. That is, in the fact that they do not think that crimes like drunkenness, adultery, deserve even a word of reproach, let alone painful punishment. Actually, they think that these things are fine. That's why they are against these punishments, etc. Such people should just have the courage to declare that they are against Islam, instead of saying, no, I'm not against Islam, but these punishments need to be changed. Then he says there's a bogey of sectarian differences. If the ulama come to power, there'll be too much sectarianism. He says, in fact, decisions made by the majority agreement can be accepted as law only if the majority of the Muslims of the country wherein they have been promulgated also accept them as such. If the majority of that country accepts them, they will become a law for this country, otherwise not. As for the future, the laws that are accepted unanimously by the majority of the Muslims of this country will be enacted here. This, of course, is a contradiction in term. If it's unanimous, it's not by the majority. If it's by the majority, it's not unanimous, but khair. There's also no problem of non-Muslim minorities. In personal law, they are completely autonomous. Islam gives them complete permission. But yes, we will not allow secular law to be the law of the land. The law of the land will be Islam, but in their personal law kya hota hai? Marriage, inheritance, these sorts of things, there they will implement their particular law. This, of course, does not mean what the secularists have been asking for, which is the complete legal equality of the non-Muslim population with the Muslim population. He does not accept that. Okay? So conclusion. All criticism is Westernism is a sweeping generalization in my view. ठीक है कि कोई भी बंदा तनकीद करे ये सारा कुछ जो है westernization की वजह से, this in my view is an argument that Mawdudi, and not just Mawdudi but many ulama engage in, and this is a sweeping generalization because many of these criticisms have nothing to do with what comes out of the West but are in fact very much rooted in different Islamic traditions within our own civilization, etc. Right? Firstly. Also, some might argue, even if it is westernization, maybe westernization is not such a bad thing. After all, the West is growing very rapidly and very, very quickly. So maybe it is westernization, but maybe westernization is, what we need for progress, etc. There's that point of view as well. So he takes it almost as a given that westernization is necessarily bad. He doesn't feel the need to even prove that in any way, shape or form, although I don't necessarily accept that criticism and argument, etc. But nonetheless, that argument can be made. There is also denial of human will and agency, which is very apparent in Maududi. You can see that he's very much center stage in the Ash'arite point of view. the point of view of Imam Ishari and the anti-Mutazila point of view. He's very much centered in the Jabriya point of view, etc., and in Imam Ghazali's point of view and so on, which is of course mainstream Islam, mainstream Sunni Islam, but it's not necessarily the only interpretation of Islam. He is also not ready to change the gendered nature of society, the segregation, etc., that we see in Muslim societies and civilizations. He's not ready to rethink that at any level. And in fact, the main opposition to Maududi really came from Pakistan's women and feminist movements many a time, especially the Women's Action Forum was very much opposed to Zia's Islamization. My mother was also part of it, and many other women, etc. So he's also unwilling to grant non-Muslims equal rights with Muslims, okay? He does say that Islam gives rights to non-Muslims. That's true. But again, there's two things to consider. It gives rights to certain non-Muslims. Not all non-Muslims have those rights. For example, Ahmadis, anybody who's declared a kafir, does not actually have that right. Because as you know, according to traditional Islamic jurisprudence, if somebody has been takfirified, if they've been declared a kafir, Muslims do not have a pact with them as such. So the pact is with certain minorities, and those minorities are of course Christians and others, etc., and people of the book, etc., but it's not necessarily with everyone. Moreover, the pact is that they have freedom to worship, and they have freedom in their personal, that personal law will be according to their own religion, but they do not have equality of status at the national level. These are things that Maududi is not ready to grant. And in my view, Jamaat-e-Islami is not ready to grant them. In fact, in this period, the religious right, in particular Jamaat-e-Islami ka main plank ye tha, that when the election occurs in Pakistan, non-Muslims should vote for separate non-Muslim candidates. Christians should only vote for Christians, Muslims should vote for Muslims, Hindus should vote for Hindus, Sikhs should vote for Sikhs, or whatever the case is, right? So the religious lobby of Pakistan till 2002 always argued for separate electorates. Why? Because if non-Muslims are voting for Muslims, and Muslims can vote for, sorry, not you, non-Muslims, whoever that is, right? Then that means that the person who's elected is not necessarily representing Islam. Who is he representing? The public, people, everybody, all Pakistanis. Non-Muslims can vote for me, Muslims can vote for me, I can be a non-Muslim and stand in the election, etc. That's not something that Maududi thought was according to Islam. Okay, because he wanted an Islamic state. So the head of state had to be Islamic, the prime minister had to be Islamic. By the way, Pakistan ke jo non-Muslims, and they have always rejected this. They said, what do you mean? We can vote for any candidate that we want to. There are many important reasons for this. I won't go into the detail, but one reason is that non-Muslims are spread all over the place. There is no viable constituency of the Christians in Punjab. There's no viable constituency as such of the Hindus in Sindh, etc. There's no viable constituency of the Sikhs in Punjab either. They're so spread out that in fact that election turns into a bit of a farce. So they say, no, we would rather vote for the local candidate. It could be Muslim League, it could be People's Party, PTI, whatever. We also want to vote for Imran Khan. What's your problem? Why can't we vote for Imran Khan? Right? In 2002, when Musharraf tried to implement the separate electorates, all the non-Muslims said, we're boycotting the election. We're boycotting it. And itna bura boycott hua, itna bada boycott hua, in fact, that it was reversed then. And the government said, okay, we're giving up on this whole idea of separate electorates. And to their credit, the ulama also gave up on that campaign of separate electorate. Today we do not have separate electorate. Non-Muslims can vote for Muslims and so on and so forth. But basically from the 50s till 2002, that was one of the central ideas of the religious parties. Last but and most importantly in my opinion, and this is I think my main criticism of Maududi, is instead of considering certain general principles to be unalterable, when Maududi Sahib writes about what is unalterable in Islam, right? Notice that he's talking about specific laws, like the law on alcohol, interest, gambling, punishment, adultery, inheritance, intoxicants, etc. Not that I care much about intoxicants. I'm happy that people should not be involved in intoxicants and so on. Same with interest, gambling. Interest, तो मैं कहता हूँ बैंक सारे खत्म कर दो, socialize कर दो, nationalize कर दो, banking खत्म कर दो, socialism ले आओ. खैर छोड़ो, उस बात को छोड़ो. Point मेरा ये है कि what I find interesting is that what is unalterable for Maududi are specific end products, specific laws. Whereas I would have thought that what ought to have been the end product for Maududi should not be specific law, or for any Islamic scholar or for Muslim, etc., should not be the specific laws, but it should be the general principles under which those specific laws are made. What is it that Islam aims towards? A society of equality, a society of social justice, a society of whatever it is. Those general principles, the laws only serve those general principles. And this, in fact, is the point of view of nearly all Islamic reformers, which is called the Maqsad-e Sharia, Maqasid-e Sharia. That first you have to understand what is the purpose of the Sharia, and then you have to see whether a specific law is matching that purpose or not. And so Mawdudi kind of starts the opposite way. He starts from the law, doesn't describe the actual purpose of that, but says this is unalterable. What I would think is more unalterable for a religion ought to be the general principles on which that religion is established. And for me, of course, that means that if all of humanity is created by God, by one God, that means that all of humanity is fundamentally equal.